Okay, Invasion of Russia. Let's do a quick review on this. Should mention this was a review copy. I don't want to touch the camera. I'm hoping that everything works out okay. Alright, so I guess the first thing I can say is in spirit, and I mentioned this earlier in the playthrough, this game reminds me of the competitive type of game like No Retreat. I'm not quite sure why. It's not that the systems are the same. It's more the kind of thinking that's involved in it. You're faced with choices that are very painful and agonizing type of choices. That's not necessarily a positive for me, but I know a lot of people like that kind of game where they're not doing a lot of fiddly stuff. They're really kind of concentrating on, okay, here's the main thing I want to do here. And I also felt that actually about All Is Lost Save Honor, although it was less of a purely competitive flavor to it. But it may also just be the subject matter, the broad scope of Russia being covered on a small map. And let's speak to the components a little bit, although I probably spoke to them in the intro. The map is very, very sturdy stock. It's pretty. You have to flatten the hell out of it, or else it's going to pooch, but it does flatten because it's not very big. When you start doing this heavy stock on larger maps, sometimes it's kind of annoying, and one of the few times that I want to do Plexi. Turn record track two-sided. Player aid contains most of the information that you really need to access during the game. You may have to look up a few. You will have to look up a few rules. The cards, like in All Is Lost Save Honor, are not the sturdiest type. They're not terribly thin, but they come out of a thing you have to rip off. So you get these, I don't know if you can see them, but you got these little nubs on them, which are a pain in the ass to trim. I would suggest not doing it. If you're going to play this a lot, you probably want to sleeve the cards, just because they may not be all that sturdy, but that's okay. You may also be able to, it may not be that big a deal if they get a little marked up or something. Counters are pretty. I had a lot of trouble manipulating them physically. Maybe the larger size, maybe the glossy finish, whatever, they were constantly falling over on me in a way that I'm not used to. With smaller counters, there's fairly decent sized stacks, not huge, but decent sized stacks of kind of wider counters. That just seems to always be a problem there. But they're pretty, and they have what little information they need on them fairly clearly discernible. The only thing that's iffy on them is if you're playing the optional rules, which I was. The foreign contingents for the French may not be totally clear, especially the green. I have kind of a green-blue colorblind issue, I think. Difficulty discerning between them. And green on blue, like I have to really kind of stare to tell, is it that or is it something else? The rulebook, the paper, very hard stock again. And the beauty of this is you could actually pencil things in, which is important because there is some errata. And I had some questions, which I had to answer. The rules are not ironclad in the sense that I found a few points that I felt were not adequately explained. In particular, the relationship between, well, so one is by clearly reading the rules, one issue, by a strict reading of the rules, there were issues that I think maybe were not intended. For example, the French depots can exist on their own without troops in them, but for the French to give victory points for the city, they have to have actual troops in them. And the fact that that difference was there led me to kind of mod it and then kind of ignore my mod, which is kind of weird, but I remember something where I wasn't sure exactly what they meant by it as well. So I think there were a couple of places where I didn't feel like they really hammered the point home in an unambiguous manner. But for the most part, it's pretty solid. The errata is largely clarifications rather than rules replacements, but some of them are kind of important, like unlike a failed attack, an aborted attack does not preclude a player having further opportunities, but you can pencil those modifications in. And my favorite part is, of course, the format itself, the box, if you wish, the sleeve that it comes in. I really like this format, especially since it has the name along the spine, which I think is an important thing to do. What about the actual play? So the play is kind of weird in this game because it focuses on these supply depots and trains in the sense that you have so many supply units and you have to place your depots in such a way that you maintain supply. Okay, that's all good and that makes sense. You don't have to physically move them. At first I thought it was going to be kind of like Desert Fox with this dual use depots in mobile and non-mobile side. Now what it is well, it sort of is, but it's more abstracted than that. And what you do is you activate your units by throwing a depot on top, a supply wagon on top of them. And that supply wagon can turn into a depot immediately, basically. The supply wagon's also, though, necessary for movement, for rally, for anything you want to do. And for the French, to some extent, it's necessary for supply as well. Their units that aren't being directly supplied for activities are going to start taking attrition through the forge process, which is a little less severe than the regular attrition process in the sense that you have a chance of avoiding attrition. And then you do kind of a pulsed activity. Here was one place where it was definitely ambiguous, whether or not rally and movement are intertwined together in pulses, or whether you did one before the other. The way the structure of the sequence of play is written implies one thing, but the actual writing of the rules seems to imply the other. But neither one really hammers it down. I think that it is meant to be an intertwined situation where you take turns playing them. Likewise, I think the depots are outside of that, if you want to convert supply wagons to depots, which feels a little strange, but okay. But they're in a different phase of the turn. So for actual movement, you basically, expend one of your supply markers that you've already allocated to a unit, and you move the unit. And, well, if you move it too far, and too far is basically the extent of its normal movement, you're going to have to roll an attrition roll. In addition, you could force march, which gives you a worse attrition roll, and it gives you a little marker that says you suck in combat, if that comes up. Because it's pulsed, because you're kind of trying to play with the timing and everything, I feel like there are opportunities that are hard for me to obtain, and I'm in danger of losing power here. I feel like there are opportunities that are difficult to judge, and you want to kind of game that system, and that means that I'm working too hard mentally on the, oh, but if I do this, will he do this type of thing, which I really don't like doing. That's fine if I'm playing a card game, but it's not really my favorite thing to do when I'm playing a war game. What I like to do when I'm playing a war game is come up with a broad goal and not try to play gimmicky little impulse delaying actions. However, there are some games that works well with, and as I get more and more used to playing a particular system, I get more comfortable with making those decisions, and they begin to be less painful. Early when I was playing this, it was really taking a toll on my play. Later on, in part because there weren't as many options, I was able to kind of say, okay, well, it doesn't really matter. The Russians have so many supply trains that they can delay the French, and I can just force the French to keep going with real moves before I commit myself. And then, of course, the French take the least important real moves first, and eventually it comes down to 3 or 4 units where you have to think. But at least it reduces the amount of that kind of stress a little bit on my mind. What else? So then combat uses this sort of momentum concept, which is if you start winning, basically you have a certain number of combat command points, which make it possible for you to do combat. You're going to have to roll a die to see if you get into the combat at all. And they also make it more likely for you to get reinforcements. And what that means is one side or the other has the initiative and can force combats and gets better results out of the combats. In particular, I'm not sure I like the reinforcing factor of it. So if you're defending and the other guy's attacking, I can understand why it's difficult for him to coordinate his units without the good combat command levels. It serves as a certain inhibitor to the amount of major combats he's willing to commit to. That all works fine. And I understand why one side's strategically on the offensive and the other strategically on the defensive. What's a little more painful is that the strategically defensive side is less likely to reinforce each other based on a lack of combat command points. And that makes it very hard to turn the game around. The only thing you can count on as the Russians, if you start losing, to turn the game around is the weather. And if the French start losing, oh boy, I got no idea. I think it's all over at that point, pretty much. Unless they get very lucky, because combat itself is a fairly has a fair amount of luck in it, in the sense that you're each rolling a d6, so there can be, you know, up to a 5-point swing in either direction or whatever, in terms of the amount of casualties you have. So any close combat could be turned into a significant victory for either side, but a lopsided battle is just going to be a lopsided battle. Now, when you include the fact that reinforcements are also kind of randomized, even what looks like it's going to be a lopsided battle could end up conceivably going the other way, which is okay. I like that kind of freedom. So there's some possibility that you could turn things around even if you're on the losing side, but it's really hard. Now, that I think adequately serves as a simulation if the game flows the way the actual campaign did. But if the game does not flow the way the actual campaign did, if the Russians wish to take the offensive at some point after they've started losing, or if they wish to stand and defend, they're going to have a hard time. Something like Borodino is actually probably something of a chance effect for the Russians to be able to get enough force into one combat that they actually have a fair chance of winning it, perhaps. I think that's a flaw in the design. And there's nothing you can really do about it except maybe giving a bonus to the defender to bringing his troops into combat. The actual combat itself is basically each piece is worth a strength point. And the way they get around the different qualities of pieces is you can stack more pieces that are better. Better pieces stack a little easier. That actually adds a mechanical burden to the game. I found myself regularly counting stacking points and sometimes finding I had exceeded them and just being kind of upset about that. And you come up with a differential value of 2 modifiers based on the number of units involved, the strict number of units involved, combined arms factors, terrain effects to some extent, although most of the terrain effects are just the French can't go here and the Russians can. Rivers and fortified cities are a little different. Well, Forest Rough and Marsh also have a modifier there, which I wasn't paying attention to. How about that? It's a fairly strong one, stronger than I thought. We'd apply. The leadership value of the forces, and then some of the optional rules can add additional things. For example, having the right leader to command the right troops ends up being this bonus in the optional rules. And then you just basically roll the dice and make a comparison, and the differential between the two totals is the amount of damage the loser kind of takes. There are some provisos to that. Disordered units aren't going to do any damage. The winner kind of takes half the damage. And there's edge cases there. What if you tie while the attacker takes a loss, whatever. And those count for that. But it's a combat system that's fairly simple. The problem with it, of course, is because it's fairly simple, if you're me, you might not look at the chart as much as you want to and might miss that there's an Ore Forest Marsh or Rough here. But again, that's life, you know. But I feel like that probably also aided the French. So that actually leads me to the balance question, which I'll get to in a little bit, but I'm probably not terribly qualified to talk about that for more reasons than usual. The usual being, hey, I only played it once. And in this case, I played an optional rule and took a very divergent path from the historical, so I can't even see how well it really stacks up against the historical. And strangely, the reinforcements come at the end of the turn. And with some of the options, you start rolling for reinforcements. The French start withdrawing foreign contingents, etc. The optional rules, I think, are pretty cool. I don't know what effect they have on the balance. So one of them is the random events cards. These are really clever. I really like these. So unlike your CDG style cards, where you draw a card and it's like, oh, you know, I have control of the weather for a battle, I better hold on to that until it's important, or whatever. What you have here is things that you're kind of forced to play. You have one in your hand and you draw one. You got to pick one now. And the one that you pick may be helpful, but it's more likely to be bad for you. And then the things that are truly uncontrolled by the players, perhaps, are going to be full random events. You draw one of these, you must play it, and it immediately takes effect, and you don't get a choice on the matter. And those can be a mixed bag going one way or the other, although in general, given the campaign, they're probably usually bad for the French. I was surprised not to see anything that withdrew all the Austrians from the game, but maybe I just didn't get to that card. They had the commander capabilities, which basically adds some special rules for commanders, and it also, checking my power again, it also says, hey, you know, you got to have the right commander with the right troops, and you get a little bonus for that. And that little bonus is kind of cool. It adds to your command rating for a lot of purposes. The kind of iffy one, which is the cavalry. Napoleon brought a huge cav reserve with him, and it basically died within the first few months and became a useless force, or mainly useless. And they have kind of a system to simulate that dying off. So they give you a bunch of counters you put on the board, and then you roll dice to see how many of them die. And the Russians get to pick which ones die, so you get the worst of the bunch. With that, probably not a terribly useful thing to add, but it adds a little bit of flavor and lets you see something. And there's penalties to them surviving, which is that you end up having to supply them, so you have less overall supply trains, which is kind of cool little... It's a cool flavor type thing, Chrome, but I like that. Then you have political rules that open up a lot of different options. So for example, trying to free the Ukraine as a whole, the foreign factions leaving the battlefield early, possible Swedish reinforcements. And then the final thing, kind of the biggest thing, is, hey, do the French want to extend this and winter in Russia instead of pushing on as hard as they did? Do they want to set up winter camp sometime earlier in the game? And they have to kind of do it by September. This is an interesting option. Now, I played moving it into the 1813 and wintering in Russia, and it felt to me like the obvious choice if you have that option. So it also felt to me like it really, well, the French have the option, basically. It really skewed the game in favor of the French. My game felt almost like a cakewalk in a lot of ways, at least once I got to that point into the second year. But then again, I made some cheats in favor of the French accidentally, gave them more mobility than they should by not rolling for attrition here. Maybe didn't force them to garrison their depots as well as they should. Certainly not according to my mod. Like I said, I kind of ignored that. But I don't know what the designer intended there. It felt, see, I made the mod because it feels to me like the designer intended for those depots to be garrisoned in unfriendly territory. It doesn't really make a lot of sense to expect a garrison to protect itself in that situation. On the other hand, they have to be in cities, so you could say, well, you know, there's defensive capabilities to cities that a depot would have the capability to do that, but then why would you not give victory points for those cities at the end of the game? And all kind of questions came in my head, and I decided that probably they should be garrisoned, and then proceeded to garrison most, but not quite all of them. And ignore that problem. In part because early in the game I was playing it by the rules as written, and then made a decision later. So had I known from the beginning, I could have planned for the garrisoning a little better than I had to, instead of wasting moves to try to move units into the garrison when they could have just left troops there behind from the spearhead units. But there were a number of things, the possibility of more attrition and the spearhead units, and maybe some overstacking mistakes that happened, that may have given it an advantage to the French that was that skewed the game into being a little too easy in the 1813 scenario. But on the other hand, when I looked at what the 1812 scenario was going to be like, if I just continued on through the winter, I said, I don't want to face this. I mean, if I'm given the choice not to do it, I'm not doing it. It looked like it was clearly going to hurt the French more. There are some trade-offs in the 1813 scenario. The Russians get more reinforcements, the French get more desertions. But overall, the French had too many troops in my game. And I don't think that the couple 1 in 6 chances, well, quite a few 1 in 6 chances, but say the 3 or 4 units I might have lost to attrition due to cheating for the French would have made that big a difference in the total French force. So, the big question there would be, would I have not moved as fast because I'm an idiot and don't like to lose troops, so I move cautiously? Or would I have not had a strong enough spearhead if I had charged forward as hard as I could to, say, take St. Petersburg quite as early as I did? I didn't take it that early. It got me to 1813, and part of the thing was I could have taken it earlier in 1812, except that the triggers that generate the decision for 1813 are such that I could not have captured as much territory as I did. Now, if you put a spearhead going straight for St. Petersburg or Moscow, and just threw all your effort to that, you could get there, and there's an advantage to doing that, which is that prevents the foreign contingents from leaving. There's another thing. The distinction between French, maybe it's in the glossary. Yeah, so here foreign contingents include the Austrians. French units include French troops, their allies, and commanders. So, you know, when I saw French, I assumed they meant the blue pieces and not the white pieces. I wish the Austrians hadn't been treated quite as differently as they were color-wise. But maybe that's necessary because they have their own special supply source, etc. It's just they didn't feel like French units to me because they weren't blue. And in particular, if French units, because this affects the ultimate supply source, for the French, this is the western map edge. For the Austrians, this is the southern map edge within Austria. Okay, well, are the Austrians French or not? You know, again, some little ambiguities that really probably should have been nailed down. A word only in there for the Austrians. This is only the Austrian map edge. Would have made it clear that this is a special case, and this is why the Austrians need special rules. The Austrians also have an optional rule, which I was of course playing with, where they can't attack unless they have support from some other nationality, which basically meant to me that they were going to serve as a rear guard to grab those last couple of victory point cities that I didn't want to garrison. Now, this is the weird thing of the game. You don't want to conquer all that territory. You don't want to sit on all of it. You really kind of want your attack to be this straightforward axis and then spread out from it when it's time to win the game. Which may seem strange if you're more of a World War II type player, but it does fit the Napoleonic concept a little better. You do want to get key places that you're not going to be able to spread to easily, though. And you do want to make sure that you take your defensive positions in the forefront. Once you reach that front line, you want to make sure you have it all. But your rear area stuff, chances are the Russians aren't going to build their 1813, their over-the-winter troops back there, because they'll just be out of supply and unable to run with them. Supply works a little differently for each country. For the Russians, basically, their units are fine. Well, they're not fine. They become disordered and useless, but they survive. For the French, most of their units will die off if they're out of supply. Veterans won't unless you hit the winter. And, I was just looking at it as the winter was going to destroy the entire French army, as it historically did. And I didn't want to face that. The way the victory points are scheduled, you have to hold a majority of Russia, and on top of that, you need to make sure that you account for whatever points the Russians have on here. And the Russians start off with 12 points here. You get a point for each major victory you get. Now, I was able to get a lot of major victories, mainly because the Russians had to attack me to have a chance of winning the game. So they kept making attacks and weakening themselves and positioning themselves in ways that I could hit them when I probably couldn't have otherwise quite as easily. I also cheated in favor of the French in terms of the lousy terrain, not giving a bonus for that. Now, that probably didn't mean much. The 2 points on an attack, most of the attacks were not that close, but some were. And if you combine that with the spearhead, I might not have been able to make certain attacks that I needed to, or at certain stages of the game. I might have had to wait for more troops, or had to take a chance and maybe turn the momentum, which would have been terrible. Anyway, overall, I think there's something very interesting to this game. I can't really speak to the balance. The feel of it is that of the highly competitive game, but there is a fair amount of luck in it. So you can't just expect the best player is going to win every time, especially the early luck of the Russian units if you're playing with the option of whether or not they can move. I think the basic game is probably the more competitive version of the game. And of course, I didn't play that at all, and wouldn't play that, because I always like to play with all the neat little toys and everything. As a simulation, the fear that I had of Russia of winter, after having looked at the rules and looked at the charts and everything, driving me to go to the 1813 scenario, I think that almost speaks for itself. I'm terrified of what would have happened during that, and the level of success that the French had in my game is tainted by the fact that I cheated for them. So it might have been a much, much closer game. And it's possible that it's a close game either way. It seems unlikely to me, though. This was the thing that I was thinking of. My view, and until I play more of it, I can't tell you this for sure, but my view is that the 1813 is a lot easier than just pushing through the winter. And if that's the case, one of those options is not going to be a balanced game. And I can see where the 1813, the cakewalk that it was, if that was severely degraded, that would be a close game. But I think that 1813 scenario actually would be significantly harder than it was, but probably still tilted towards the French. For the winter scenario, I'm just so terrified by it. My feeling is it's going to take a really, really good really good French player to outmaneuver the Russians and then survive the level of attrition that they're going to take in the winter. Now, how bad is that attrition during the winter? Well, for the units that have to take attrition, it's bad. But what else is bad? I'm not sure. Does the chart look terrible? The chart doesn't look like it gets that much worse across the board. Yeah, maybe it's not that horrible. Maybe it's survivable. So they may not be that different. I was just looking at the what the penalties were for winter. They're not all centralized in one place. Forage is certainly going to be painful, but it's not like you have less supply wagons. Oh, I know what it is. It's you do have less supply wagons. It's the supply distance gets shrunk in the winter, which means that the French force that I could keep mobile and active at a range of 5 hexes for each from depot to depot, that shrinks down to 3. So not only do I have less supply wagons, and thus I can only thrust with a small force, more of my units are going to be foraging, which means I have to roll for more of them, or they have to sit on supply depots and just garrison. But I also have to go back and build those depots unless I built them from the beginning and decided I'm going to play the whole game as though it's winter. So that's the big difference, is that the French don't have the ability to keep pushing on quite as hard as they would, and many of their units are going to be sitting there unmoving, and if they're outside of depots, they're going to be just melting away. All right. Anyway, glad I was able to think of that. Overall, I do think it's an interesting system, and I think it would appeal, again, to the kind of person who doesn't want, who wants to have a lot of thought on their moves, and a lot of that kind of gamey aspect of, well, if I move this here, now you can counter move, you can do this, and keeping all that into account instead of just kind of watching the broad sweep the way I usually do. Not to say that there's, historical flaws or anything in it, or that it's an uninteresting situation to watch develop. It's just that the kind of thinking interferes with my view of the narrative of the game, and that's probably the thing that hurts the most for me on a single play. Now, what I found out with All Is Lost Save Honor is I play something like that, 4 times in succession, and I get so used to it that I internalize those decisions and they stop being a hindrance, the same way that I've internalized, other bigger games, because I have a longer time to play them and to get used to them. This didn't last long enough for me to get used to. I didn't play enough scenarios of it. I didn't, play it for like an OCS game where after I play, 20 hours of it, I'm like, this is really kind of growing on me. This hasn't gotten to that point, but I think it might. I think it might if I can give it more shots. I do think, though, that it shines much better opposed, probably, than it does solitaire. All right, sending it up.